So the definition of scientism itself isn't that controversial. What's controversial is whether it is a good thing or not a good thing. So scientism is basically a position. I call it an ideology, but it's a position. It's a philosophical position, if you like, that it's actually espoused by a number of scientists, whereby all of the important questions and all of the effective ways of answering those questions are grounded in the sciences. There is anything else, it's either reducible to science, or it's useless, or it's not important, or it's not worth pursuing. That's the position. That one, I don't think that definition in itself is very controversial. What is controversial is that I, for example, think that that's a bad idea. And let's say Alex Rosenberg or even my co-editor Martin Badri think actually that's a perfectly good idea. So that's where the controversy is. Now, I think of scientism as kind of the extreme opposite of pseudoscience. What puts them together, in fact, this book that I did with Martin goes very well with another collection of essays that we did 2 or 3 years ago, also for the University of Chicago Press, which was called The Philosophy of Pseudoscience. And that one also has, a mix of accessible chapters and more technical ones.
Welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better, where we explore how you can apply insights from visionary leaders and the most provocative philosophers and scientists of our time to make your life and our world a better place. Here's your host, author and speaker, Paul Gibbons.
Hey, welcome back to Think Bigger, Think Better. I have to say the coolest thing about doing the Think Bigger, Think Better podcast is who I get to talk to. And this week we have Massimo Pigliucci, a philosopher of science and a fascinating guy. And a million miles from how dry that subject may seem, quote unquote, on the cover. One listener blew my mind this week when he said Think Bigger, Think Better was among his go-to podcasts, up there with Sam Harris, which is by far the most flattering remark I've had so far. So my mission is to make Think Bigger, Think Better worthy of that kind of praise. So I'll be working on that. Please send me an email if you've reviewed the podcast so I can send you a book by one of our authors. And if you like it or even love it, please tell your friends. Before that, thanks for all the kind words, feedback, and comments. I'm trying to get a diversity of subjects and views, and I realize that that's both a strength and a weakness. One week you'll have philosophy, the next week you'll have science, the next week economics, the next week politics, the next week personal change. I hope you can see that as an asset. And last week's podcast with Mark Walsh was certainly an outlier, talking about the far reaches of personal development. It was also extremely popular. After this week's podcast with Massimo Pigliucci, we talk about evidence, particularly in psychology, with two really amazing contemporary psychologists, Rob Breener and Scott Lilienfeld. If you've ever wondered about psychological mumbo-jumbo and psychological pseudoscience and psychological myths, these are the guys you need to talk to. We're going to cover myths such as learning styles and right-brained people, whether there is such a thing, and you'll find these podcasts really amazing and interesting, I think. A bit later on, now going well into the spring, we're going to have Steven Pinker and Michio Kaku. Both of them have new books that I'll discuss at the end of the show. And I've got invites out to Richard Branson and Elon Musk, so fingers crossed. It's probably easier to see the Pope than it is those two guys. But they're two particularly inspiring business people, and I'd love to get some more inspirational people on the show. Your suggestions, of course, very welcome. So who is this Massimo guy? Well, here's a question for you. How do you make the claim that astronomy is a science and astrology is not? It's a pseudoscience. What allows you to make that claim? Why is homeopathy, for example, a pseudoscience compared to contemporary medicine? That problem is called the demarcation problem, and it was first concisely stated by Karl Popper in the middle of the 20th century. But there's another huge demarcation problem, the scientism problem. This started in the early 20th century and is accelerated today. It's the view that science is the measure of all things. You remember in the Dead Poets Society when Robin Williams takes out a graph of a poem and he puts importance on one axis and aesthetics on another axis from the textbook on poetry, and then he tells students to rip that nonsense out because it's BS. Well, that's an example of scientism, trying to reduce everything to axes and numbers and the scientific method. Scientists, some of them, have said that science should replace philosophy, and that's gotten philosophers pretty darn agitated. So we're going to talk about that demarcation problem and the original demarcation problem between science and pseudoscience. We also talk about Stoicism and mindfulness and atheism and synchronicity and soulmates and the placebo effect. So we really do cover an amazing range of topics. And I was like, this guy's a fascinating guy. So let me tell you more about him. He's a professor at CUNY, City University of New York, and has a PhD in evolutionary biology and a PhD in philosophy. The guy's a glutton for punishment. His research interests include the philosophy of biology, the relationship between science and philosophy, and the nature of pseudoscience. He's got an amazing social media following. He was a co-host, co-founder of the Rationally Speaking podcast. He did 132 episodes of that. He contributes to Skeptical Inquirer, the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, is a fellow for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's published many books on science and pseudoscience and has a popular book out on Stoicism. The notes on that are in the show notes. It's called How to Be a Stoic. He wrote that, interestingly, while wandering around Rome, which I think is a very good way to write a book. He's very active on social media, and he has an immensely popular blog called Footnotes to Plato. So hi, Massimo. Welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better.
Thanks, Paul, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Good stuff. So you've been a podcaster, you're a blogger, you're a professional philosopher, you're an author, you're an NPR, you're a public figure. So I guess one question, it's kind of a personal question, but when do you sleep?
Actually, I need at least 8 hours of sleep a night. Otherwise, I don't function well.
Right.
So the real question is, what else do I do in life? And all of these things come at it with a trade-off. So I try to balance, professional life and outreach, and of course a little bit of personal life, especially living in New York. Sometimes it's a little more difficult than it should be, probably, but I manage.
Yeah, we all do. We all struggle with that. So yeah, you seem insanely productive. So tell us, just to add a little color, one thing about yourself that listeners might find, amusing or interesting or eccentric that they wouldn't find in your official bio, or what's a dirty secret?
I practice kickboxing.
You're a kickboxer.
Yes.
So if you
probably won't find that in my official CV.
So tell me this. So if you don't defeat someone on the debate stage and with intellectual discourse, you just kick their ass. Is that? That's
right. That's the idea. Now, the idea is that since I was young, I was actually interested in martial arts, not as a sort of way of beating the crap out of people, but because I think they are a great physical exercise and they tend to focus your mind. So they're also some kind of a mental discipline. And so when I was younger, I practiced judo and kung fu and things like that. And now I kickboxing and sort of Thai style. And I find it fun, and it's like it's very helpful when you get all nervous or worried about something, and you go to the gym and just start kicking and punching, and you feel much better.
That's very cool. You won't know this, but last week's podcast was with someone who talks a lot about embodiment. He's not a philosopher, although he's a very clever guy, but he talks a lot about the body and how many of our intellectual life and our emotional life are, in fact, have bodily correlates, and that you can't change your mental and emotional life without working in some respect with the body.
Yeah.
So you're describing that in very practical
terms. That's right. There's a new book that I just read a couple of reviews of. I haven't read the book yet, by Antonio Damasio, who is a very good neuroscientist with also a good interest in the humanities and philosophy in particular. And he just wrote a book about the ubiquitous of feelings and how the body, and the body and the mind are not two separate things. They're just, they interact deeply with each other. And so we think with every part of our body, not just with our brain.
Yeah, it's just a tangent, but I've always been interested in about why human beings have such trouble understanding probabilistic concepts or nonlinearity, and because we have a linear abacus on our fingers, and it strikes me as the brain is structured for that sort of thinking, but we can't conceptualize. We don't embody probabilistic thinking in the same way. It's a very naive reflection, but What do you
I
think?
think there's some truth to it. I mean, we have much easier time conceptualizing things that we can, physically experience or with which we have familiarity. And yes, of course, we do tend to think linearly because we experience time linearly. We have these 10 fingers that we count with and that sort of stuff. So yeah, you're right. Then anything beyond that requires special effort. But we're pretty good at doing that as well.
We are also good at doing that as well. Cool. Well, one of your things I want to talk about science and scientism and pseudoscience because those are things that they're very relevant to the podcast. I'm also passionate about them myself, but I want to hear a little bit about a recent passion of yours, which is modern Stoicism. What got you interested in that as a biologist and a philosopher of science? Why Stoicism, which seems like a sidelight? What's practical about that? What's interesting about it?
Yeah, it started out in a strange way. So a few years ago, I went through a kind of what you might describe as a midlife crisis. And instead of, finding myself a younger lover and buying a red Ferrari, I tried to do something positive with the crisis. And the first thing I did was I changed career. So I went from biology to philosophy. But once you get to study philosophy, then even though my specialty is philosophy of science, you start thinking more broadly. I mean, you can't help it. The first graduate level course that I took in philosophy was on Plato. The second one was on ethics. So, it kind of forces you to think a little bit outside the box. And I realized that I had considered myself up to that point sort of a psycho-humanist after having grown up Catholic and become essentially an atheist by the time I was a teenager. I've always, if somebody told me, so what do you believe about life, the universe, and everything? My response was always something along the lines, well, I'm, psycho-humanist. But I also realized once I started thinking about it from a more philosophical perspective that psycho-humanism is nice and all, but it's really kind of a amorphous philosophy. I mean, there's really no much of a structure there. It's just if you look at the humanism, the different versions of the Humanist Manifesto, for instance, it seems like a laundry list of things that I like and I agree with. And that's fine as far as it goes, but it's not quite satisfying. So I started, considering the possibility of studying philosophy for personal benefit, not just professional, more systematically. And immediately I gravitated toward virtue ethics, because that actually, I think, goes very well with a secular humanist perspective. And so I studied with Aristotle. And then from Aristotle, I moved to Epicurus. And when I was doing that, I kept thinking, yeah, these people all have something interesting to say, but nothing is quite clicking. And then one day, just out of the blue, on my Twitter feed, I see this thing that says, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I said, yeah, as I said, what the hell is Stoic Week, and why would anybody want to celebrate it? And so, but I was curious, and I said, all right, let me click on this thing. Turns out, Stoic Week is something that has been going on since 2012, I believe, and it's organized by an international group of philosophers and cognitive behavioral therapists. Initially based at Exeter University in England, but now it's pretty much a worldwide phenomenon. And what it is for a week, usually sometime in October, in the fall, in October or November, you get to try out the Stoic approach to life. You download a manual, you read Stoic texts, you practice meditations and other exercises, and then at the end of the week you say, oh, okay, how did that go? How did that feel? So I did it as a matter of curiosity and as an experiment on myself, and I felt very, very good about it at the end of the week. It really felt like something was clicking all of a sudden. And so I wrote to the organizers. I said, look, I want to commit to doing this for another couple of months until the end of the year. Can you provide me with resources? And they were very nice and sent me a bunch of other stuff that I could read and continue my practice. When I got to the end of that year, I said, this really seems to be working well. It's not only giving me a sort of a broad perspective on a number of things and, life and what am I doing and why am I doing it and all that, but it's also actually making me more conscious of my choices, more attentive and mindful about things. I got irritated much less. And, so there were actual practical consequences of this thing. So I decided to stick with it. And now it's, almost 40 years later, I'm still doing it.
For almost 40 years later. Wow. 14.
Four
Four
no,
years later.
I'm pretty young. Yeah, I'm
Yes,
pretty young.
you are. I was just looking up your birthday. We're the same age. You're a little younger. You're a little younger than me. Yeah, that's cool. It sounds like many of the benefits that people discuss, well, actually, that research has established for mindfulness meditation. What do you see as the link between the two?
So that's an interesting question because people very often point out the similarities in terms of practice and also in terms of ethics between Stoicism and Buddhism. In fact, so much so that I've come to think of Stoicism as kind of the Western equivalent to Buddhism. They started out at about the same time. Stoicism began maybe a couple of centuries after Buddhism, but they're about the same age, more or less. The thing is, the analogies, the similarities are very interesting and they're plentiful. But of course, the thing with Buddhism is that it evolved for 2.5 millennia in a bunch of different traditions, in a bunch of different directions. And so when we talk about meditation in Buddhism, there are actually a number of different types of it, some of which are very different from what the Stoics do, and some of them are actually very similar. The Stoic meditations are not the type where you focus on your breathing and think about a mantra and try to sort of let go your thoughts, that sort of stuff. It's actually quite the opposite. You focus on a particular thing that is bothering you or a particular issue that you have, and you try to reflect on it in a critical way. So it's what's sometimes referred to as analytic meditation.
Sure.
And there are versions of that in Buddhism as well, but it's not the typical thing that people think of when they think about mindfulness.
You kind of dig into it in Buddhism and mindfulness practice. Most mindfulness practice that I've studied or understand is you let go of the thing. You imagine it as a branch drifting down a river and you just let it pass from your awareness, something like that. By contrast, and I forgive my ignorance that I'm not familiar with this Stoic practice, but you dig into it a bit more. You train your analytical faculties on it.
Yeah, so there's different ways of doing that. But by the way, I do also practice that kind of mindfulness meditation that you're talking about, the letting go of things on imagining a river and things like that. But that's outside of Stoicism. So in Stoicism, there's a number of ways of doing this. One is, which I find very useful and I do every day. It's kind of keeping a philosophical diary. So before going to bed, I take a few minutes and I get on my, in a quiet mood and in a quiet place in my apartment, and I start writing down some salient thoughts about the major things that happen during the day. And specifically, I try to answer 3 questions which come out of Seneca, one of the top Stoic philosophers. And the 3 questions are, what did I do right? What did I do wrong? And what could I have done differently? And the reason here is, the reason to do that is that, so when you answer the question and what did I do right, that's because you actually want to pay attention and remember the things that worked out, and you want to pat yourself on the back in a sense. It's like, oh, good, that was a good thing. Then you ask yourself, what did you do wrong? And the point there is not to sort of indulge into regret and say, oh, I wish I'd done something different. That's pointless, because the Stoics teach you that the past is outside of your control, so it's let it go. There is no point on that. But you do want to learn from it. And so asking yourself, what did I do wrong today, is a way to pay attention to your own mistakes that you might otherwise, pass by or sort of rationalize away or things like that. And then the third question is interesting because it's, what could I have done differently? The rationale behind this is that often we actually experience similar situations over and over in life. I'm a teacher.
What's called Groundhog Day or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. A Groundhog Day kind of thing. So, I'm a teacher. I go to school. I teach. I interact with students. I interact with colleagues. I have my partner. I come home and I interact with her, and I have my daughter, and so on, and my friends. So very often situations kind of repeat themselves. And so if you've done something that didn't work out quite well, then it's a good question to say, well, next time that happens, what might be a better strategy? What might be a better way to deal with the problem? And if you pay attention to that every night, then little by little, you sort of become more mindful in the sense of paying attention to, and hopefully improve your behavior.
Yeah, that's great. That's that's very good. That's very enjoyable. Well, we could have another, of course, podcast just on Stoicism and mindfulness. And I do want to get to Scientism and pseudoscience, but tell me, just for the benefit of listeners, please, the name of your book on Stoicism, and also where they can find the link to Stoic Week, because that sounds fascinating.
Yeah. So the link to Stoic Week is at a site called modernstoicism.com. And there you will find information about Stoic Week, about an annual conference for people interested in Stoicism. It's called Stoicon.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I actually organized the one, 2 years ago in New York, and last year I was in Toronto, and this year is going to be, I think, at the end of September in London.
Did you say in London?
Yes, in London.
Oh, that's my hometown. I might have to go to that.
Yeah, good. There you go. As far as my book is concerned, the title is pretty easy. It's How to Be a Stoic.
Okay.
And you can find it in bookstores or Amazon, whatever. It's published by Basic Books. And it was a lot of fun to do. That's the book that I wrote during my sabbatical a couple of years ago. And it was a really interesting experience because I imagined, so that the basic idea of the book, instead of just having yet another book explaining to you the nuts and bolts of Stoicism, because there's a bunch of those out there already, just like there are for Buddhism and other traditions. What I imagined was that I was in Rome, and I was in ancient Rome, and I was walking down the streets with the companionship of Epictetus, who was a major Stoic philosopher. And in order to do that, I actually moved to Rome for a few months, which is my hometown anyway. Rented an apartment near the Colosseum and the Roman Forum, and I actually did go and walk around quite a bit for an inspiration. Of course, Epictetus was with me only in my mind, not physically. But so the book is this back and forth. Every chapter starts out with a very short dialogue between Epictetus and myself about a particular practical topic, because Stoicism is a very practically oriented philosophy. And then the rest of the chapter sort of develops the ideas from there.
That's terrific. That's fantastic. My bro Epictetus, go out and prendere un caffè. I can't remember the Italian expression. What's the Italian expression for wandering around, just wandering around?
Passeggiare.
Passeggiare, yeah, with Epictetus. That's cool. That's very cool. That's fascinating. What a great approach. There's both a physical journey and an intellectual journey, and then, of course, your journey as a career. So that's what a fun project to do. That sounds like a blast to me.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. And in Rome, right? Which is,
And in Rome. So, that can't hurt.
So cool. So I will put links to all of that for listeners and my website and in the show notes and all of that. And I'm going to dig into that myself. I have restricted, even though I study Western philosophy, I don't know much, almost nothing about Stoicism. Certainly not later Stoicism like Scientism and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. So anyway, yeah, I'm going to look into that both on a personal basis and sort of an intellectual basis too. And maybe we'll talk further. I don't know. Let's see about that. But let's segue. Listeners, their heads are going to be spinning, right? Okay, what are these guys talking about? Mindfulness, and now they're talking about this. No. One of the things that fascinates me and that I take a lot of time in my writing is the difference between science and pseudoscience, which is what's called the demarcation problem. And I think it's actually a discussion that's one of the most important ones for humanity, in a sense, to have with itself, if I can use that as a metaphor or an analogy. I think we need to come to some sort of cultural agreement about things like this, about how we distinguish it. And I'd love your view on that also. But what is your, if you will, take on the difference between science and pseudoscience, let's say astrology and astronomy, or evolutionary biology and creationism? But why for non-professional philosophers or non-scientists, why should people care about this? What's the big picture importance of a question like that? That's not just academic masturbation, if you will.
Right. That's right. Yeah, there is quite a bit of academic masturbation going on. But in this particular case, I do think this is one of the topics that is actually very important from a practical perspective, and from a variety of points of view, actually. One of them is actually ethical, believe it or not. I mean, I just quoted the other day to my students a phrase by Thomas Henry Huxley, who basically said, it's essentially immoral to willfully believe things that are not true. And that's an interesting point that he was making. That is, if you believe false things, things that are known to be false, not only you're making, you're fooling yourself for one thing, but also you're likely to make decisions based on false beliefs that are going to affect your life and the life of other people. So if you don't believe, let's say, if you do believe that vaccines cause autism, which is false as far as we can tell, it is a pseudoscientific notion, then you're not going to vaccinate your kids, or you're going to support initiatives so that other people are going to be able not to vaccinate their kids. And that's a problem, because then you're causing actual harm to other people. If you think that climate change is a conspiracy of scientists and it's not real, it's not happening, and therefore there's nothing that needs to be done about it, then you're hurting literally the entire planet. So, beliefs have consequences. Of course, some beliefs have more consequences than others. Lots of people read the horoscope for fun. They don't actually act on it, right? And sure, you can do that. But even in that level, you sort of get yourself into a habit of mind of entertaining, more or less seriously entertaining notions that are actually patently false. And let me give you another example. I mean, you remember a few years ago, this thing came out called The Secret, the book and DVD and all that sort of stuff.
Yes, I was sort of semi-new age, or I was recovering new age.
There you go.
And my wife at the time was going deeper. It was one of the reasons I'm divorced. She was going more deeply into that sort of belief set. So yes, I'm very familiar with The Secret.
Now, the problem with The Secret, so, a lot of people say, well, what's the harm in that? I mean, if you believe basically that the basic notion is it's not really very secret at all. It's this idea that the universe somehow responds actively to the intensity or your thoughts and desires. And so if you really want something, a new career or a new partner or, whatever it is, and you focus on it and you really think about it really hard, then somehow this thing is going to happen. The universe is going to rearrange itself. Now, first of all, the hubris that just because I want something, the universe is going to,
The egocentricity of that is remarkable, right?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, just to go back for a second to Stoicism, I found it very funny that 2 or 3 years ago when I started reading Epictetus, I actually found a quote by him in the Discourses, which is one of his books, where he says to somebody, somebody's complaining, one of his students is complaining, he has broken a leg, and he's very upset about it. He's like, these things shouldn't happen. Shouldn't have happened to me. And Epictetus says, what do you think, that the universe is going to just listen to you and rearrange itself in order so that you don't break your leg? And I said, wow, this guy knew about the secret just 2,000 years earlier.
Maybe he got a preview.
Yeah,
supernatural preview.
Wow. But going back to the secret itself, so the thing is, people often say, well, what's the big deal? I mean, if people engage in some kind of wishful thinking or positive thinking, maybe things in fact are going to be easier for them, even though the universe isn't going to turn around and do it for them. Well, to some extent that may be true, but at the same time, imagine then if you really want something and then you fail, or let's say you're struck by a disease, you get cancer. Obviously you want to get better, but it's not happening. Well, now you're starting, if you really believe something like the metaphysics of The Secret, then you're going to start blaming yourself, because it's like, oh my gosh, I got sick and I'm not getting better because apparently I don't want to get better.
My intentions aren't pure enough, or at some level yes.
And so that becomes, blaming the victim instead of solving a problem. And that seems pretty awful to me. I mean, if you're already are in dire straits, you have enough serious, real problems to think about, and I don't think you need to add to those fabricated problems that come out of a metaphysics that it's nonsense.
But there's a level at which it's true. There's a level at which, with our intentions, I've written a fair bit about this, with that sort of intentionality that people in the secret lovers would say, is that focusing on something or putting the attention out there in the universe. You focus the data. I always use the example, if you focus on, I want to have the intention of having a cruise around the world on a yacht or something like that, and you put that out there. If all the data that attacks you, the modern social media and traditional media or something like that, if you focus, if that's an intention that you have, at some stage or another, the world will reveal itself to you. Your observation of the world will, how can I save money? Or you may be stumbling across a magazine, and rather than skimming through the ridiculous ads for stupidly expensive and unnecessary things, you see, oh, wow, there's a picture or an ad for or something like that. So in some senses, intentionality works. So what's the harm in believing that it has a supernatural component?
Well, the thing is, so intentionality certainly works, and planning works, and having reasonable ideas about what you can do and what you cannot do. Definitely, those things work, and they're very helpful. And there is a lot of psychological literature that supports that. There's no question about it. The problem is that if you start believing that there's something supernatural, you kind of, in a sense, create expectations that are very unlikely to be fulfilled. Because it's one thing if I have a desire and it's a reasonable desire and it's something that I can, I can do. It may be difficult. It may require resources and energy and time, but it is something that I can do. It's a completely different thing if I start engaging in sort of wishful thinking about things that are obviously not going to happen. Like, if my desire is to write a new challenging book that at the moment I have no idea how to, even start, well, I can sit down and think about it and say, okay, what do I need? What do I want to do? What steps do I need to take, right? But if my desire were to become a star soccer player playing in the Italian Serie A, no, that's just not going to happen. I'm 54. I never played soccer very well.
Right.
I just don't have the skill, the physiques, and everything, and it's not going to happen. And so, if I start indulging into these kind of fantasies, where if I only want it, hard enough, that's going to happen. I'm at the very minimum. I'm wasting a hell of a lot of time and energy that I could use better.
Sure. Well, I sort of have an answer to that. It's sort of answer my own question. It's parallel to yours. I don't know what you'll think about this, but it struck me. I had a sister that was very ill. She was 40 and she's in the hospital. Wasn't clear whether she was going to live or not. She was in a Catholic hospital in the United States. And then a lot of my friends were religious at the time or spiritual at the time, and they talked about it. And then when she was eventually cured and, fully healthy, thankfully, she's 15 years on now, people said, oh, it's a miracle, or, oh, prayers were answered or something like that. And I felt to me is that they were indulging in a kind of blasphemy. Now, we usually use blasphemy to describe attacks upon the deity or attacks upon the supernatural or higher powers or God or whatever. Yep. But this to me was a disservice to the doctors and to the nurses and to the caregivers and to the institution of the hospital and to the institution of 2,000 years of modern medicine. This was a product, a gorgeous, beautiful product of a very human miracle. And I thought to begin to attribute supernatural agency to something like this was a blasphemy upon the human race and the miraculous things that humans are able to do. And so that's why I take issue with supernatural interpretations. People go, oh, well, they're harmless and people believe what they believe. I think when we do no disservice to the miracles that human beings can create when we work together and collaborate and through the miracles of science and art and architecture and history and all that. So that's my, in a sense, response to my own question is that
you're absolutely right. I mean, if you think about that particular example, so when people say, "Oh, thank God I survived this thing," as opposed to "thank the doctor" or the nurse or whatever. Yes, in a sense, you're indulging in a blasphemy. First of all, actually a religious blasphemy, because you are actually attributing to God something that it did not probably do.
Sure, it's a false belief about yeah.
But also, you are doing a disservice to, as you were saying, to the human enterprise. You're not giving credit where it's actually due. And furthermore, again, think about the hubris, right? I mean, people often say things like that. It's a miracle for much minor things. I mean, I could understand psychologically somebody who just, suddenly got out of a bad cancer. It's like, that was a miracle. It wasn't, but I can understand the psychological sort of need to say so. Consider instead people who say, oh, it's a miracle that I found and they mean it, that I found a parking slot this morning and, going to work. It's like, really? You think that God is concerned with you finding a parking slot when you go to work? I mean, what the hell?
Better things to do.
Yeah, it's got better things to do. And, or think about athletes who score a goal or, the Super Bowl or something like that, and then they kneel down or they look up and thank God for that. No, thank God. God doesn't give a crap if the Patriots are losing or winning the Super Bowl. I mean, it's a really bizarre thought. It's a very good example, I think, of hubris. We think that we're much more important than we actually are.
We are, and there's also the opposite truth, that we think we're much less important by doing this. There's a kind of, one of the things that I like about the definition of humility is its right size, is that you appreciate in a sense, the powers of your own agency, but also the limits of your own cognition and agency in the world as well. So by supernatural attributions such as that, you think you can either fall into the trap of not thinking enough of yourself or of the human agents that do it, or thinking rather too much of yourself and your importance in the great scheme of things. So it's not really a humble sort of stance in that respect, I don't think.
That's right. Right.
There are some of these religious beliefs that they're now we're getting sort of slightly sidetracked again, but some of these religious beliefs again can be very useful. And these are questions that I still wrestle with. So I don't propose that I have definitive answers, but a lot of spiritual people believe in something called synchronicity, which is that when you meet someone or there's an event in your life or something like that, that are sort of meant to happen. Now, again, okay, that's super hubristic, right? Like, okay, yeah. But on the other hand, if you treat that encounter as if it is, in some sense or another, ordained or there's some kind of agency, sort of quote unquote meant to happen, you'll treat that encounter in such a special way that in a sense your agency, your actions, your beliefs, your, how you treat the encounter will be immensely more productive. And I think, people believe in supernatural. Again, there's the supernatural interpretation of synchronicity, which I think is false. But there's the very practical thing is if you treat encounters as if they're synchronous, there are many psychological and productive benefits. So I don't know what your view on that is.
Sure. Well, I mean, sure. Again, it's true that false beliefs can be instrumental, right? I mean, that's what we're saying. Look, the classic example in medicine is a placebo effect, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Give somebody a sugar pill or a homeopathic pill, which is the same thing, and they feel better. And it's entirely psychological, and it's got nothing to do with the reality of the effect, but it has to do with the fact that it does have some sort of psychological effect. So there's an instrumentality to certain kinds of false beliefs. What I'm concerned with is that then you get into the habit of sort of entertaining false beliefs, and one of these days you're going to apply that to situations that actually are going to turn out not useful, but in fact dangerous. And in fact, homeopathic medicine is a very good example. I mean, if you're trying to cure your cold, let's say, with homeopathic remedies, well, go ahead. Nothing cures the cold anyway. It doesn't matter what you do to the cold. The damn virus, it's unbeatable. We've tried everything and we can't seem to figure out a way. So if you want to take a sugar pill, even though it's an expensive sugar pill, go ahead. And if you feel better just because you've done something and you fool yourself into thinking that your symptoms are actually improving, hey, more power to you. I don't particularly care. But then the thing is that now you're beginning to believe that homeopathy itself, it's actually working. And now you may be tempted to apply it to something more serious than just a cold. And perhaps applying, using homeopathic remedies instead of, actual medicine that actually works.
As Steve Jobs is, of course, the classic case of real tragedy. Yeah,
that's right. Talk about a smart person who did a really stupid thing. So, that's what I'm concerned with, is that the indulging, even for pragmatic, for instrumental reasons in false beliefs, then lulls your mind into broadening more and more those kind of beliefs. Let me give you another example. So last night I was at a fun event in New York on the philosophy of love. And it was
sound fun.
Yeah,
it sounds like a good place to get a date too. Actually, I should try it.
Yeah, probably, probably. And it was a bar which is set up. It's a place called Caveat in the West Village, which is actually set up as a kind of a place where you discuss ideas and have drinks and meet people. So it's kind of fun. It was kind of fun. But one of the concepts that were talked about was this idea of a soulmate, which is kind of a supernatural idea as well. And by the way, we know exactly where that comes from. At least the official source of this is Plato.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Let me tell you this story because this is a lot of fun. So Plato, if you read the Symposium, which is one of the fun dialogues by Plato, the Symposium is a dialogue on love. Okay. Where, among other things, you get sex advice from Socrates, and that doesn't happen very often. So, It really was. And not only that, but a symposium was actually, it's a general term with which the Greeks indicated a meeting of a few people, of a few friends over drinks and food to talk about philosophy, art, and all sorts of other things. So it's a fun thing to do. And the dialogue actually tells the story of this particular evening among friends. One of the things that happens is that at some point this guy named Alcibiades crashes the party at the last minute, and Alcibiades was a very famous person in Athens. He was a general, and he also happened to be a friend, student, and lover of Socrates. So it's like it's really interesting. But the story that I wanted to tell is that one of the guests is Aristophanes, the playwright, and Aristophanes tells this story about the origin of love, and he says that early on, human beings were actually much bigger and much more complex creatures. We had 4 legs and 4 arms and 2 faces, right? And we were so powerful that the gods started getting, worried about it. And then Zeus at one point said, the hell with these people. Let me cut them in half. So he sent thunderbolts and he cut each one of us in half. And then first the 2 halves around the globe.
I'm remembering this now.
Yeah. And ever since, says Aristophanes, we've been looking for other half, for the perfect complement to ourselves. Now, that's a very romantic idea, and it's a very cute story and all that. But if you take it seriously, and a lot of people actually do, one of my colleagues had a show of hands in her class, and half of her students believe that there is such thing as a soulmate.
Sure, only half. Only half.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. That's probably an underestimate. But if you believe that sort of stuff, then you're setting up for yourself for failure, because, right? I mean, now you're going to look for this perfect complement of yourself, which of course does not exist, and then you meet real people who are going to fail one way or the other. They have their own idiosyncrasies and problems and issues and so on and so forth, and you're going to be miserable, or at the very least, like you're feeling forever like you never reached your potential, because you didn't really meet the soulmate. So
everybody, there's this idealization. It's a good way. It's a good way of keeping yourself single, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. Or in a bad relationship.
Or in a shitty relationship. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah. Very, very good. I could see we need to do 6 podcasts, not one. But anyway, that's cool. So now we've touched on love and social sciences, Stoicism and philosophy and atheism and placebo effect and. and now, yeah, this is great, So the thing that I really wanted to talk about is your book called Science Unlimited. But we talked a little bit about the demarcation problem between science and pseudoscience, and how cordoning off beliefs, pseudoscientific beliefs, can mean you'll endorse pseudoscientific practices in perhaps other areas of your life where they could do harm, and some pseudoscientific beliefs cause real harm. So we spend a lot of time on that demarcation problem and the practical implications. Scientism, I guess we'll need to start first with the description of that. And I know that's contested, but we'll need to start with a brief description of that. And then why, again, as we did with science and pseudoscience, why should people care about something that, again, can look abstract and abstruse and of little practical relevance to the day-to-day life of real human beings? So that'll probably take you about an hour and a half.
Well, those are both excellent questions. So the definition of scientism itself isn't that controversial. What's controversial is whether it is a good thing or not a good thing. So scientism is basically a position. I call it an ideology, but it's a position. It's a philosophical position, if you like, that it's actually espoused by a number of scientists, whereby all of the important questions and all of the effective ways of answering those questions are grounded in the sciences. That is, anything else, it's either reducible to science, or it's useless, or it's not important, or it's not worth pursuing. That's the position. That one, I don't think that definition in itself is very controversial. What is controversial is that I, for example, think that that's a bad idea. And let's say Alex Rosenberg, or even my co-editor Martin Badri, think actually that's a perfectly good idea. So that's where the controversy is. Now, I think of scientism as kind of the extreme opposite of pseudoscience. What puts them together, in fact, this book that I did with Martin goes very well with another collection of essays that we did 2 or 3 years ago, also for the University of Chicago Press, which was called The Philosophy of Pseudoscience. And that one also has, a mix of accessible chapters and more technical ones.
Would it be ridiculous for readers, for listeners to think about a continuum between pseudoscience, if you will, on the left, science in the middle, and scientism on the far right? Some sort of continue. Yeah, okay, it's not an unreasonable way to think about it.
No, not at all. In fact, I think of that as a continuum, and a continuum that is defined in the following way: that pseudoscience is a misuse of science to support notions that are in fact, false or dangerous or things like that. So it's a misuse. Pseudoscientists love to use the scientific jargon. Parapsychologists or Deepak Chopra, the quantum mysticism and all that sort of stuff. They love to use the jargon of science, but I think it's a misuse of science, meaning because it's a science that, something that is not really scientific, but it's in the guise of science. At the opposite extreme, scientism is also a misuse of science, but in sort of the opposite way. It's almost an imperialist attitude, according to which pretty much anything that is worth doing is in fact science, and everything else doesn't really matter. It's not really that interesting. It's not important. So yes, I think there is a continuum, and I try to position myself in the middle as both a scientist and a philosopher, and say, look, science is a great enterprise. It's one of the great things that human beings have managed to do in the last 3,000 years. It works very well, although obviously not perfectly, because it is a human enterprise after all. So the history of science is littered also with dead ends and blunders and things like that. In fact, there is a book that came out a number of years ago called Scientific Blunders, and there's a number of them. But science in itself is...
for the popular audience, though, I think of that as a feature, not a bug. One of the arguments that I get into people they say, first we couldn't eat fats and now we can't eat carbohydrates, and science just changes its mind every 5 years, and it really doesn't matter what you believe because next Tuesday it'll be different. A sort of a nihilism with respect to science or something like that. And I'm at pains to explain that that's why it's not religion. And that's a feature and not a bug of science. The fact that it's revised as evidence presents itself. Yeah.
Precisely. It's a feature because science is a self-correcting mechanism. And so it's a great thing, as a scientist, there's no reason or way for me to actually denigrate science. I think it's a great thing. We discovered amazing things about the universe, if you think about it. I mean, the fact that tiny, puny creatures like ours with, a brain that weighs about 3 pounds or something like that, we've been able to uncover, to push up the limits of our knowledge to, the depth of eons. We know a lot of stuff about what happened over the last 4 billion years on Earth, or the last 13 billion.
Exactly, 14.4 billion years. This 8-pound of flesh can contemplate 14.4 billion years ago, or the microstructure of the universe. It's an amazing thing, of course.
It's an amazing thing. And of course, we have the technology, right? So I'm talking to you on a tablet, which is an amazing computer, which has many, many more orders of magnitude more computing capacity than the computer that brought us on the moon. So this is an incredible thing. Science is an incredible thing, but it is not the beginning and end of everything. There are other ways. Sometimes people use the phrase "other ways of knowing," and that's kind of a funny phrase because it depends on what you mean by knowing.
Indeed,
but there are certainly other ways of understanding. I mean, I think that philosophy is a way of understanding that is significantly different from science, even though it is informed by science. I think that literature, frankly, is a way of understanding the human condition that is significantly different from science. So, and in fact, there are even different ways of knowing. I mean, my colleagues, like the most scientifically oriented of my colleagues, like Alex Rosenberg, who is a philosopher at Duke University, want to subsume everything. And so, for instance, they claim that logic and mathematics are sciences. And I think that's baloney. No, they're not. The fact they're both useful to science, for sure. We wouldn't have computer science without logic, for one thing. And certainly mathematics has all sorts of practical applications. But the overwhelming majority of what mathematicians do has absolutely nothing to do with the real world. It's an exercise in completely abstract reasoning, which works in a very different way. It has nothing to do with empirical confirmation of anything. So if you call it science, you're just stretching the definition of science beyond credibility. And so instead, you should acknowledge that, science is great. Or first of all, we should use the plural, sciences.
Yeah.
The sciences, right? So physics, chemistry, biology, are great ways of understanding the natural world. And I include human beings in the natural world, of course. I'm not making any kind of arbitrary distinction there. But then there are the social sciences. The social sciences are sciences to an extent, but not entirely. So let me give you an interesting example that was given to me last year by one of my colleagues at City College, who came to teach one of my classes, as a guest lecturer. And the guy is a social scientist, a political scientist, and he's particularly interested in the history of colonialism. And he was explaining that, yes, some of the research that he does uses, standard scientific methodology. So collection of, data, quantitative analysis, statistical analysis, and, things like that, systematic observations, all that sort of stuff. The same kind of things that an ecologist would do, let's say, or an evolutionary biologist like myself would do. But then he says, an equally important part of his job is to read books, even fictional books and personal diaries written by people who actually have experienced colonialism on either side of the divide, either as the colonized or the colonizers.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah.
Right. So those are qualitative accounts that a biologist wouldn't look at, because it's like, no, that's completely subjective. But for him, it's like, that's the point. I want to understand not just the facts, not just what happened, factually in terms of figures and numbers, but also how people felt about this stuff, what there were judgments, their rationalizations, their understanding of their own situations and their role in that situation. And that makes social science something in between the natural sciences and, in fact, the humanities. And then if you go even further out, I already mentioned mathematics, which I think it's a very different field, even though it's pertinent to science. Logic is a branch of philosophy. It's not a science. It's taught in philosophy departments. It works in a completely different fashion. It's very useful to both scientists and other people, but it's not a science. And then there is things like history, literature, philosophy in the sense of aesthetics or metaphysics or ethics. All of those things are certainly informed by scientific knowledge whenever it is pertinent. I mean, today, for instance, if you're an ethicist, if you're a moral philosopher, I think you should pay attention to what's coming out of the sciences in terms of, description of human behavior and things like that. But you can't limit yourself to that. You have to actually reason in a different way. The philosophical reasoning is different. When these people say, meaning by these people, I mean people who are positive about scientism, when they say that philosophy is just works in the same way as science, I say, have you actually read a philosophy paper?
Yeah, I do wonder.
Yeah, you kind of wonder, because, like, wait a minute. When I read a philosophy, if you give me a paper, a technical paper, and you don't tell me whether it is a philosophy paper or a science paper, you don't tell me who wrote it, in which journal was published or anything, you just give me a PDF thing and with just the text. I can tell you within the first 2 sentences if that's a philosophy paper or a science paper. Because they work differently. The methodologies are different. The approach is different. The kinds of questions that use it. So to want to insist in subsuming one into the other, I think does a disservice to both. And you were asking, why should people care other than academics and their sort of mental masturbations? Well, people should care for sort of a complementary reason to why people should care about pseudoscience, which is science is very important. It's very practical. It has a large impact in our lives. But there is also a lot of skepticism about science. There's a lot of people who reject the theory of evolution. There's a lot of people who reject the notion of climate change. And when scientists themselves, don't check their hubris and make these grand pronouncements that, everything else doesn't matter. It's all about science. I can give you the answer to any question that it's worth answering. Then people are turned off.
You've just done something very interesting. I got to say I think you've done. So we talked a little bit about a continuum between pseudoscience, science, and scientism. And what you're saying is it's not a linear continuum, but actually there's a circularity. That in fact, from the social consequences of scientism, actually lead you back to some of the pseudoscientific practices and beliefs.
That's right. That's exactly right. And let me give you a specific example. So take evolutionary psychology. So evolutionary psychology is an interesting discipline. I actually considered it at the borderline between science and non-science, because the basic idea is perfectly sound. The idea is, can we apply evolutionary ideas, evolutionary theory, to human behavior? And the answer is, well, we should be able to, because there is no reason why human behavior should be an exception in the animal world. And, humans evolved and
Sure,
will be
100%.
able to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if you just take straight evolutionary biology and import it straight into psychology, there is one big, humongous chunk of thing you're missing, which is cultural evolution. Human beings certainly evolve as biological beings, for sure. But we also have an incredibly complex and flourishing culture and diverse culture. And so if you tell me things, simplistic evolutionary psychologists would say things like this, like, the reason men like to buy, sports cars is because they want to attract their mates. Sure. To some extent, that might be true. I mean, there's something to be said for that.
Yeah,
but
it's like a peacock's feathers
exactly,
or something
like
like
a peacock
that.
tail.
Yeah.
But in fact, it turns out that there's a myriad way of instantiating that kind of basic desire of impressing a potential mate. And besides, there are some people who actually do like sports cars, period, regardless of what the effect is on a potential mate. You cannot explain, let's say, gourmet cuisine by saying, well, human beings need to eat food, therefore that's why they have gourmet cuisine. No, they don't. I mean, if the question is just biological, and I care only about the biological aspect of it, there's no sense in making this big apparatus of very complicated, restaurants and rating systems and television shows and all that sort of stuff. That you don't explain that by reducing it to biology. Now,
it's a causal reductionism, right? It's
Exactly.
just saying it's trying to reduce buying a Ferrari to some single cause. Now, we say it that way, it's ridiculous, right? I mean,
is biology one of the causes? Absolutely. Nothing that we do is entirely independent of biology. Everything we do is affected by biology. But affected is one thing. Completely subsumed by it's a totally different story.
Well, let's take the methods of your chosen scientific evolutionary biology. Is hypothesis testing in the Einsteinian way of, developing a hypothesis, and then we can do an experiment 14 years later in 1919 to determine whether gravity actually does bend light. The classical predictive hypothesis testing, the sort of the high watermark for science, if you will, if you could call it that, or something like that. Can evolutionary biology and the social sciences make these kind of predictors? Historical sciences make these kind of hypothesis testing? Does that make them non-science, or is that a different way of knowing, or how do you?
So yes and no. I mean, so is there such a thing as hypothesis testing in let's say, the social sciences or evolutionary biology? Yes, of course there is. But it doesn't work the same way as in fundamental physics. And that's for good reasons. It's not just because physicists are one group of people and biologists another group of people. It's because
there are people, scientismists would want to say that physics is the high standard to which all science, all knowledge should aspire, which is, I think, not nonsense.
Can I call bullshit on that?
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah,
and here's why. I mean, there's serious reasons why that model of physics as the queen of sciences doesn't actually work, and I think a lot of philosophers of science would agree with this point. Here's one way to explain it. Fundamental physics has to do with literally the simplest things in the universe, like atoms and quarks and electrons and things like that. And these things are ahistorical. That is, if you do an experiment, they don't have a history. If you, or at least better, they do have a history, but a history doesn't matter. If you are a physicist and you're doing an experiment in a particle accelerator, it doesn't matter where those particles came from. They're just electrons, or they're just photons, or they're just whatever it is.
Sure.
And it doesn't matter.
They're decontextualized, I guess. Yeah.
Right. In the case of evolutionary biology, on the other hand, you can't do that, because if I do the same experiment on the same species, even of plants, let's say, because I was working on plants when I had a biology lab. And I repeat the same experiment with a different population of the same species, or with a closely related species, or with a species that is not so close related. I get different results. And it's not that I get different results because it's a mess and because, I don't know how to do experiments. It's a feature, as you put it earlier, not a bug. It's because different populations and different species have a different history, and they carry that information with them into the lab. And so you need to pay attention to the historical component of it, which means that your questions are going to be answered in a different way. Now, let me give you the example of social science. Social science, not only it's historical, because the way human societies work and the way culture works depends obviously on history and geography. It's not the same everywhere. But moreover, now we're talking about experimental subjects like human beings who are not only have a history, they also are sentient and reflective, capable of reflecting on things. So they will come up with their own answer to whatever question for their own reasons. And you may not have a way to control for everything. Psychological experiments are very difficult for the simple reason that they're done on subjects who are actually aware of the fact that you're doing an experiment on them. That's why psychologists come up with all these really clever ways of tricking their subjects and basically try to hide as much as possible what is the real goal of the experiment. But that's not easy because people think about this stuff. And moreover, consider that the majority of psychology experiments are actually done on psychology undergraduate students because they're cheap. And so these are people who actually know what you're up to. So part of the replicability issue that the social sciences now have been deeply affected by, it looks like, like about a third to 40% of the classic experiments in psychology are not reproducible. That's not because psychologists don't know what they're doing. It's because it's very difficult. Physicists have a much higher, simpler, easier job. It's much more expensive because it's much more expensive to build a particle accelerator than to get 30 undergraduate students into a psychology lab.
Yeah.
But the subject matter of psychology and the social sciences is incredibly complicated, and so and it's historical, and it deals with people that actually have their own behaviors and their own motivations.
So let me say something that I say. I don't know if I could defend this to a philosopher, but one of the things I say in one of my books is that psychology and the social sciences are where physics was in about 1650 or 1700. It's not that they're by necessity inaccessible to a scientific method. It's just, and the lack of reproducibility and the lack of predictability is that we don't yet have, we're still, in a sense, groping around in the dark the way we were with alchemy and understanding, the basic structure of matter 400 years ago. So feel free to tell me that's bullshit, but that's, no, feel free. I mean, legit, feel free. I mean, it's something I say, something I certainly believed at the time. I think I still believe it, but what, am I wrong?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, that is definitely a reasonable way of looking at it. I mean, this is, I don't think there's anything wrong with that kind of reasoning, but I do think it's an open question. And some philosophers, in particular, Nancy Cartwright and Ian Hacking, for instance, have written books a few years ago about the plurality of sciences, or the disunity of science, as they call it. And in those books, they argue. Another one is John Dupre, who is at Exeter University. And in those books, they argue that when we talk about science, we're making actually a confusing statement, because we should be talking about the sciences as a sort of a family, right. Plural, as a family resemblance kind of
family resemblance, a Wittgensteinian family resemblance. Yeah.
And so it's a type of activity. Those are types of activities that do share something in common, but it doesn't mean that they can all be done in the same way, and that eventually their trajectories are going to go in the same direction. In fact, an argument has been made by Jerry Fodor, who is a brilliant philosopher with whom I disagree on a bunch of things, but he died just a few months ago. And
that's a shame.
Yeah, I had my disagreements with Jerry, but Jerry was also a brilliant philosopher who did a lot of writing about and a lot of thinking about sort of the nature of science. And he said, look, the classical version of the history of science is the one that you just put forth. That is, eventually all of the sciences will sort of congeal into one big thing. E.O. Wilson
be a branch of physics. We'll all be a branch of physics.
Exactly.
Yeah, basically.
They'll all be a branch of physics. E.O. Wilson wrote a book about this a number of years ago called Consilience of the Unity of Knowledge, where he thinks not only all of the sciences would come to one thing, and that thing basically it's going to be physics, but everything else, including the humanities, philosophy, and so on. And Jerry,
that's a big claim.
So Jerry Fodor made that the observation is like, okay, well, so if that's true, then we should see at least some movements in that direction, right? We should see the sciences and then the humanities being, little by little sort of subsumed into fundamental science. And he says, in fact, what we observe, what has happened in the last half a century or so, it's the opposite. The individual sciences are spinning further and further away from physics, and the social sciences is spinning further and further away from the natural sciences because they have their own problematics, they have their own issues, they have their
Sure.
own methods. So I don't know. You may be right, and it may be that psychology is at an early stage, and it will get to some kind of maturity that we find in physics, or it may just be that psychology is a
May not. Yeah.
significantly different kind of beast, and
Sure.
we'll see what it goes.
I could definitely be wrong. It's kind of a hubristic statement. You mentioned a couple of authors on the disunity of science. I want to be able to put one of those books in the show notes. What one would you say would be most accessible? Because I mostly my reasons are personal because I'll probably go buy it. But which ones of those would you think is best?
So one in favor of these consilience of things of science is the one by E.O. Wilson. It's called Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge.
And he's about the convergence. So basically, we're all going to be a branch of physics. That's that stance. And who takes the opposite stance?
Correct. And the other, the one that takes one of the best ones that takes the opposite stance is Nancy Cartwright. And one of her books is "What is Wrong with Why the Law of Physics Are Lying" or something like that. I think that's more or less the title. It's just fascinating. If you read them back to back, it's like, wow, these people have completely different ideas about where science is going.
All right. Well, here's one way that we can sort of begin to go into the wrapping up phase of this. You have in your rogues gallery taken on some of the most important public figures right now in the world of public understanding of science, of popularization of philosophy. I'm talking about people like Sam Harris. I'm talking about Stephen Hawking. I'm talking about Lawrence Krauss, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Michael Shermer. I mean, those guys are, in a sense, if someone had to name, those would probably be on everybody's top 10, right? A who's who. Yeah. And sort of you take particular exception to some of their thinking on things, your sort of so-called rogues gallery. So I think it would be really illuminating for readers, listeners. I'd be really interested in that. But I do want to actually, you talked about Fodor, remind listeners of a Fodor quote. One of the things that I've written about a little bit is why some of this neuroscientific fMRI stuff is bullshit, and why trying to understand gross behavioral mental events through neuroanatomy is well, we're 100 years from being able to do that, I think, in any kind of rigorous way. But Jerry Fodor said something very famous. He said, we know that the mind is north of the neck, he said. What exactly turns upon how far north?
Yes, exactly.
Which is very good Fodorism. Who cares where it's happening?
Fodorism. And in fact, Jay wrote this interesting book years ago that was a direct response to one of the famous early books by Steven Pinker. So Steven Pinker, the linguist at MIT, cognitive scientist, he wrote this book, How the Language Works, How Languages Work, or something like that. That was the title. And Jerry Fodor wrote a book, the title of which was The Language Doesn't... the title of Pinker's book was How the Mind Works. And the title of Jerry's rebuttal, basically, is The Mind Doesn't Work That Way. I thought it was a great title for a book. I mean, I bought the book just because of the title. It's like, okay, I got to see what this guy has to say.
Well, certainly two of the great minds of the 20th century. I'm having Steven Pinker on to talk about the Enlightenment in a couple of months, which is very, very exciting for me. So anyway, back to our rogues gallery about these bad boys.
Yeah,
of course.
Comment about those bad boys. First of all, I would make distinctions. My disagreement varies depending on which one of those people you mentioned. So, like, I have fairly major disagreements with Sam Harris, let's say, and much more minor disagreements with Dan Dennett. It's a continuum. And as far as let's say people like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Stephen Hawking, I certainly don't disagree with anything that they say about physics, but I do disagree vehemently with their take on philosophy. And I talked to Neil a number of times. I mean, I don't know Stephen Hawking personally, but I know Neil, and we've had plenty of discussions about this stuff. So it varies from person to person. But let me take the sort of just one example, which is the increasingly popular notion that science, and in particular neuroscience, is going to be able to answer moral questions. I think that you can take that statement in two different ways. Either these people are saying something really profound and revolutionary, and also just as equally clearly wrong, or they're saying something that is absolutely true, but it's also trivial. And specifically, the idea is, what do you mean by science answering moral questions. Let me give you a specific example. So let's say that we're discussing the morality of abortion, for instance. And let's say that we agree that abortion is permissible up until the point in which the fetus begins to feel pain. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that that's where our discussion has led us. Well, at that point, science becomes relevant, because who is going to tell you the best guess of the moment in which, in development, the fetus begins to feel pain? Well, that you have to ask a developmental biologist and a neurobiologist. Those are the people that are going to answer that question. So the biological answer is definitely relevant to the moral question. But notice that it hasn't answered the moral question. If the moral question is not, when does the fetus begin to feel pain? That's clearly a scientific question. The moral question is it permissible to have abortion, and up to what point and what circumstances? That kind of discussion, that kind of question is, I don't even know how a scientist would begin to tackle that thing. It's like, what kind of experiments would you do to say, is it a permissible or not permissible to do certain things? Now, Sam Harris would say, well, you just look at the consequences of the decision, and you do whatever maximizes people's happiness and minimizes people's pain. That's in fact what he does say in the Moral Landscape, which is a book that he wrote about this stuff. But that's just assuming, that's sneaking in the philosophy without
Yeah, of course it is, yes.
Right, because that statement I just gave you, that basically is a summary of utilitarian philosophy, utilitarian moral philosophy. But utilitarian moral philosophy is not the only type of ethical framework. And it needs to be defended on its own right. You can't just say, oh, obviously the thing to do is to do that. No, it's not obvious at all. There's a lot of discussion.
That doesn't stand. So there's 2,000 years of ethical discussion, and that's only, I don't know if it even covers 10% of, normative ethical theories. Yeah,
exactly. That's why.
And it's deeply contested. I mean, there's tens of thousands of books probably on utilitarianism. Yeah, very good. Yeah, very good. What about Neil deGrasse Tyson? Someone who I admire, by the way. I mean, if anyone can capture the magic of science, and I'm obviously a new atheist like he is, so I mean, we're as one on that. Where does he fall prey to scientism in his thinking?
Well, he has been on record several times, more than once, in saying something to the effect that philosophy is useless, and I confronted him.
But you ask him why. When you ask him why, though, you can't answer that question why without using philosophy.
Precisely.
That's the funny thing.
That's exactly right. And at one point, I got a little bit exasperated during one of these discussions. And I asked him the obvious question. I said, Neil, have you ever read any philosophy? Any philosophy book, philosophy papers? And he honestly said no. I said, well, then why the hell are you talking about this stuff? Why don't you just shut up on it? You're great as a popularizer of astronomy, cosmology, and so on and so forth. Stick to that. Do you see me going around, trying to explain cosmology to people? No. The reason for that is because I don't have the technical background for doing that.
I don't know shit about it. That's why.
So it's to some extent, it's a question. Again, I'm going to use the Greek word again. It's a question of hubris. And I must say, prominent physicists are particularly prone to that sort of problem. I mean, take Stephen Hawking. So one of his latest books begins with the phrase, philosophy is dead. And then it keeps going for the entire book to make philosophy of cosmology. That's right. The entire book is philosophy of cosmology. It's like, what's going on here?
Yeah, man. How can you do? Yeah, I don't know. It's a peculiar thing, because these guys are obviously clever guys.
Yes,
I have to tell you, man. I was a scientist in the 1970s. I told you, I think I took my first college chemistry course when I was 11 years old, and I probably could have finished university at 15. I had to wait till I was 17. I mean, I was a very brilliant, brief scientific career. When I started to study philosophy in my 40s, I mean, I can read a scientific paper in I can get to grips with a scientific paper in 10 to 20 minutes, depending, and in a whole bunch of subjects and something like that. I spend 10 to 20 minutes on a sentence when I study philosophy. I mean, philosophy, from my point of view, is considerably more difficult than introductory.
Yeah. I had
But
the exact same experience at about the same time. I mean, when I moved from science to philosophy, I was in my mid-40s, and yes, that was exactly the experience. Holy crap, this stuff is difficult. And
yeah, no kidding.
people like Lawrence Krauss, he's another one of the people that it's on my list of rogues. So Lawrence Krauss says, look, only philosophers read papers in philosophy of science. Well, no kidding. And only physicists read papers in quantum mechanics. I mean, what exactly? And they're difficult to read. Neil deGrasse Tyson, for instance, is on record saying, philosophers use all the jargon. Oh, really? Because physicists don't?
That's a funny thing to say.
What's
They're just using that is
bizarre.
interesting.
It's really bizarre.
It's interesting, and because of the way that people learn in university and the way that we're taught to learn in school. And, the chemistry textbook for first semester of organic chemistry is 500 pages. And, you pretty much need to know that whole book, every equation and formula in that whole book. But, I spent probably, more time reading Hume's treatise, years and years trying to understand even some, relatively simple philosophical ideas. I find it amazing. If you've not studied philosophy before, it's incredibly, that's what's so beautiful about it, is that you can spend on a paragraph, you can spend an afternoon thinking about a paragraph. And I've never done that with science. So, I think it's incredibly difficult. So I'm surprised that these very fine thinkers think so little of it. I don't know whether it's some kind of parochialism or if it's ignorance, or I don't know what they're, was it Wittgenstein no, it was Nietzsche that said, rather than try to answer the question, is what kind of person would pose that question? What kind of person would make that statement, sort of ad hominem question?
It's actually
funny.
Interesting. You just mentioned Wittgenstein because often when I get exasperated at sort of the people that we're talking about, there's this famous phrase by Wittgenstein that comes to mind: "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." Which is
yes,
which is a polite way of saying shut the hell up because you don't know what you're talking about.
It is indeed what I think. Well, look, this is, from a personal point of view, this has been illuminating, and it's been exciting, and it's been fun. And, I've certainly got so many takeaways myself of things I want to delve into. And you've been super generous with your time. I mean, incredibly generous. We've been going for, I think, an hour and 20 minutes. Where can, interested listeners, where can they find you? Where can people go to hang out with you more? Twitter or whatever. Give people the 411.
Yeah. So the my two blogs, one is called platofootnote.org, and the other one is called howtobeastoic.org. So if you're interested in general philosophy and philosophy of science, go to platofootnote.org, and if you're interested in Stoicism as a practical philosophy, go to howtobeastoic.org. I'm also on Twitter at Pigliucci, Pigliucci, and I have what you would call an official page on Facebook. People can just look up Massimo Pigliucci, philosopher. And if you want to have discussions with me, just visit the page. I post pretty much every day, and then I engage readers as much as possible in discussion.
Oh, cool. And your book is called Science Unlimited. I'll put links to that in the show notes. What are you working on right now? What can listeners look forward to in the future from you?
I have a few projects. The one that is most exciting in the moment is another co-edited book, but this one is aimed at the general public. And I'm doing it with two colleagues of mine, two friends of mine, Sky Cleary, who's a philosopher who specializes on existentialism. And the other one is Dan Kaufman, who's also a philosopher, but he specializes in different kinds of things. And we're putting together this book, this collection of essays that's provisionally called Philosophies of Life. And the idea is that each chapter will present a particular philosophy, practical philosophy of life, by somebody who has actually not only studied it, but actually practiced it.
I wish you're writing one of the books that I would one day like to write, although it's more ambitious than one person could reasonably achieve.
I think
that's great.
It is. So
yeah, that's a great project.
Yeah, maybe we can have a discussion once the book comes out.
Yeah, that's great. It reminds me a little bit of another book that I wish I'd written, which is Jonathan Haidt's Happiness Hypothesis, where he looks at happiness from different lenses. So this is broader, because happiness is, of course, only one of the lenses which you may be talking about in your book. Actually, might be.
That's right.
Might be one chapter in your book. But anyway, look, I'm immensely grateful. I'm very, very thankful. I'm going to let it go there. Thank you so much for your time.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Hi, this is the part of the show when I get to talk about cool books that I'm reading and what's on my bookshelf. Maybe you're like me. I have about 25 books on the go at one time, and I dance between them. But the book I'm most excited about and concentrating most of my reading effort on is the new 600-page book from Steven Pinker called Enlightenment Now. I'm going to get Steven on the show. He's supposed to be on the show shortly, and we'll probably air that sometime at the end of March. But let me tell you about his new book, Enlightenment Now. It's the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress. And Stephen first talks about the Enlightenment and how many of the things that we treasure about our contemporary society derive from that really exciting period, usually dated in the 18th century. So he starts out by talking about reason, science, humanism, and progress. And then, well, have you ever had the feeling that the world is falling apart? If you listen to media or you listen to social media, both people on the left and the right complain about how terrible things are. And some people, particularly conservatives, often talk about time where we need to go back to older times and traditional values and the old ways. Well, Stephen says that's nonsense. That, in fact, in 75 graphs in the second half of Enlightenment Now, he talks about how much progress we've made and uses a very modern way of doing that with facts and data. And so the progress we've made on poverty, on peace, on knowledge, on disease, and on happiness worldwide, not just in the West, have been extraordinary. And so the second half of his book is a data-based sort of analysis on that, with reference to how much of that we derive from Enlightenment values of reason, science, humanism, and progress. So anyway, that's a long description of a very, very exciting book. And I want to invite you, there's a link to the book in the show notes. I want to invite you to consider the book. And certainly when I interview Stephen, I want to make sure you look out for that and get a chance to tune in. So thank you. To celebrate the launch of the show, and to thank you all for listening, I'm going to be giving away books, lots and lots of books. All you have to do is leave a review in iTunes. We're going to raffle off a book every single week for 12 weeks. So head on over to paulgibbons.net/iTunes to get easy to follow directions and let me know the title of your review to make sure that you're entered to win. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Think Bigger, Think Better. Great ideas are great, but this isn't gospel. Share your critical thinking in the comments. Where do I disagree? What insights were most powerful? If you got value, don't forget to share the value by sharing the podcast. Finally, to get information on book and blog releases and new video content, head over to paulgibbons.net and join the community of thinkers talking about using science and philosophy to make our world a better place.